Our third speaker is Dr. Kirk Jalbert. Dr. Jalbert is an assistant professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and Arizona State University's College of Global Futures. Dr. Jalbert directs the Civic Science for Environmental Futures Collaborative, a lab focused on generating participatory research projects that create equitable and just environment futures. His research examines how public participation in environmental governance is shaped by uses of data, monitoring tools, and community science projects. His work additionally examines how the public accesses the environmental and public health risks of petrochemical development projects. This work is done in service of understanding how environmental justice coalitions seek to mitigate disproportionate harms and seek greater opportunity to shape regulatory policies. Prior to his current position at ASU, Dr. Jalbert served as manager of community-based research and engagement for the national nonprofit Fact Tracker Alliance, organizing energy justice data transparency and mapping projects. Dr. Jalbert additionally served on the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's Environmental Justice Advisory Board from 2016 to 2018. Please welcome Dr. Jalbert.
Thank you for having me. Let me just move some things around my desktop here. My name is Kirk Jalbert. Thank you for that introduction, Debbie. And I'm going to be presenting today on the results of a study that we did last year. And I'm also going to report on some findings from a study that we just completed in the last month that intersect with this subject of pipelines, easements, and landowner surveys. And I just want to acknowledge my three sort of co-authors on this study here, and also that this work is funded by the JPB Foundation through the Harvard JPB Environmental Health Fellowship, which I am a fellow with and have been for the last few years. So let's see here. All right. Well, pipeline operators, they consider a variety of factors when searching for a viable right-of-way for their projects, and this is the continuous stretch of land that's needed to construct, maintain, and operate a pipeline. Perhaps one of the more significant influencing factors is finding landowners amenable to signing easements to allow pipelines on their property. Pipeline easements are the result of fairly complicated negotiations between pipeline operators and landowners, where landowners are placed in the unenviable position of weighing potential risks against the benefits of monetary incentives, usually a dollar per linear foot, a dollar amount per linear foot of pipeline. And the shape of these negotiations can depend heavily on landowners' knowledge of their legal rights, access to technical information, opinions about the industry, and sense of responsibility to their neighbors. So in the presentation today, I'm going to detail the results of a survey of 113 landowners implicated in the construction of the Falcon ethane pipeline system. And when fully operational, which is expected in the coming months really, this 97-mile pipeline will carry more than 100,000 barrels a day of ethane from 3 natural gas processing plants in Ohio and Pennsylvania to an ethane cracker facility, which is nearing completion up in Monaca, Pennsylvania, in Beaver County. So there's vast differences in public opinion on the expansive growth of pipelines in recent years, which is not unusual and unknown to our group here. Opponents raise concerns about their inherent public health risks. According to the PHMSA, more than almost 6,000 pipeline incidents have been reported since 2010, and the damages to infrastructure, environment, and private property are estimated at more than $4 billion. Pipelines also have unavoidable environmental impacts, including watershed disturbances, habitat fragmentation, methane emissions that can contribute to climate change, and not to mention the general stress of just ongoing construction activities, tensions with neighbors, and loss of property value that can impact residents' quality of life. But meanwhile, those who support pipelines view oil and gas development as a boon for economic development, national energy independence, and within these, pipelines are seen as the safest and least impactful method of transporting petrochemical products compared to other things like truck or rail transport. Now, research in the social sciences, and I am a social scientist, has sought to understand how public participations of oil and gas development play out. Multiple studies show that attitudes towards oil and gas development are highly dependent on prior experiences with the industry. A lot of studies suggest that residents in close proximity to development are less inclined to have concerns for potential impacts, while opinions tend to be more influenced by ideological positions the further away you are from development. And these studies make really important contributions to understanding general public perceptions, but far less work has been done to examine the decision-making processes that landowners must navigate when negotiating contracts with industry. And the significance of this is really demonstrated by studies like ones done by Stephanie Malin in 2016 that found that Pennsylvania farmers experienced measurable power asymmetries in signing leases for oil and gas wells due to, among other things, lack of access to technical knowledge about oil and gas extraction, as well as lack of transparency on the part of land agents representing the industry. And given how oil and gas development in the U.S. is highly structured around contractual agreements with individual landowners compared to other countries, we suggest that continuing to explore these dynamics of landowner decision making is really critical to understanding the fabric of the ways in which these projects play out. And we have found a particular gap in any studies that examine landowner negotiations related to pipeline easements, and that's why we undertook this research. So our study leverages fairly unique data on a pipeline project that was generated while I was at the Frac Tracker Alliance, and this was conducted in 2017 and 2018, called the Falcon Public EIA project, and this was based on GIS data that the company had been producing that was in the public domain and had been left in the public domain. And of the greatest importance to our study, this project, the Frac Tracker project, had compiled data for a complete set of properties that had been surveyed to establish the right-of-way, as well as all of the alternate and potential right-of-ways that Shell had explored through several years of planning. And our study focuses on the subset of properties for which landowners either signed easements or agreed to have their land surveyed in Beaver, Allegheny, and Washington County, Pennsylvania. We did this partly to be able to filter for particular regulatory structures by state. Now, we were also interested in hearing from landowners that were neighboring proximal to the pipeline that perhaps did not have direct dealings with Shell. And so we established a quarter-mile buffer to the final right-of-way, and this is a distance that is not unlike the ways in which industry will do impact analysis for disaster planning. And so this set up three different groups for us: people who had signed easements, people who had their property surveyed but not ended up with an easement, and then other neighboring properties that were within a quarter-mile of the pipeline itself. Okay, so then we did a GIS analysis and came up with a sample set of 993 properties. And surveys were mailed in February 2020, which was really unfortunate because this is right when COVID was starting to really rage. And we do think that this has affected our response rate. After adjusting for errors in the county mailing data sets, we estimate about 548 mailers had been delivered, for which we received 123 responses, and then we filtered that again for those that were complete, and that represented a 20% completion response rate. And amongst those who did respond, 10 had signed easements, 15 had property surveyed, and then 81 were in that quarter-mile proximity buffer zone that were neighboring landowners. And then just to characterize the response pool, 3/4 were white, and the average age was 34 to 65, and 2/3 were male. Average household income was more than $75,000, but this ended up trending less for those who agreed to property serving or easements. And in terms of educational attainment, on a range of having high school education to graduate degrees, it was fairly split, but trended towards less education for landowners who had their property surveyed or easements compared to the larger population. And interestingly, respondents generally expressed having conservative political views. But while 2/3 believed in climate change, less than half believed that fossil fuels were actually a contributing factor. So a little bit of characterization. So before getting into, sorry, I have windows that are blocking me here that I need to narrow. Got it. Okay. Before getting into the Falcon pipeline specifically, we felt it was important to assess their perceived knowledge of pipelines in general. And not surprisingly, we found that those had negotiated easements or those who agreed to have their land surveyed expressed higher awareness of how pipelines were constructed or operated. But it was noteworthy that most residents across the entire data set claim to have comparatively less knowledge of pipeline regulations, which leads us to believe that knowledge of pipelines comes primarily as a result of direct personal experiences. We also wanted to understand perceived knowledge relative to the information sources that landowners turn to. And across all categories, we found that landowners consistently rely on a range of sources, including news media, government officials, industry, and word of mouth. But what we found interesting here was that community nonprofits and advocacy organizations, which have been fairly active and involved in landowner outreach related to the Falcon, registered as less influential in this space. And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment towards the end of our presentation here. So turning to Falcon pipeline specific knowledge, we found that most respondents first learned about the Falcon between 2016 and 2019. But those who signed easements or were approached for surveying were aware of the pipeline on average 2 years prior to neighboring landowners. And this lines up with what we know about the typical trajectories of pipeline development, where landowners in the right of way learn about the pipeline directly from industry as they're approached for agreements, while neighboring landowners find out about it through friends, neighbors, word of mouth. And when asked what respondents did after learning about the Falcon, we found consistent patterns across all groups where they would go and discuss the project with their neighbors and look for more information on their own. And easement signers and survey properties were also more likely to attend information sessions held by Shale in their local township. So having established some basic understanding of respondents' perceived knowledge and information sources, we then proceeded to query for opinions on the risks and benefits of pipelines. And here we see how landowners break on benefits. Generally, landowners who signed easements and agreed to surveys were more likely to agree that pipelines bring energy independence, help lower energy costs, and allow for safer transport. On the flip side, we found that there was fairly neutral to moderate positions on the risks of pipelines across all groups. Neighboring landowners were more likely to believe that pipelines had negative air, water, ecological impacts than those who were directly on the right of way. And in a related question in the survey, we found that 3/4 of respondents reported being aware of a number of major past pipeline incidents, such as the Rover pipeline explosion, as well as issues around the Mariner East 2 pipeline, like sinkholes. But more than 80% of those individuals felt that those incidents had only slightly changed their opinion on the safety of pipelines, or not at all. And this suggests that expressed beliefs about pipeline risks and benefits are fairly stable, even when people are challenged with new experiences. I want to turn our attention now to the subset of respondents who had their properties surveyed and those that ultimately signed easements for the right of way. When asked about their experiences of being approached, nearly all said that they had early interest in having the pipeline on their property. However, only a subset of these landowners were aware that they actually had the right to negotiate any kinds of terms of agreement on surveying and the resulting activities. And these same landowners were then asked what factors they might weigh in deciding on their easement, and many factors were considered important to landowners across all of the ones that were suggested. But in terms of property related concerns, it was accidents, impacts to property value, loss of land use, and for quality of life issues, we see strong correlation to personal safety, needing additional income. But what we found was noteworthy across both of these question sets was how low concerns for impact to neighboring properties and impacts to the quality of life of neighbors and community were not considered as important as these other issues. So for the subset of landowners who then went through the easement negotiating process, respondents expressed having felt fairly informed of pipeline-related impacts, what their rights were as landowners, and having ample time to make decisions. As we noted previously, some landowners were aware that they had right to set terms, and several exercised this right. The most prominent subject in the negotiations were about limiting additional pipelines that could be put in the right-of-way in the future, the depth of the location of the pipeline on their property, and then compensation for any land loss. And I think that one place for future research would be to see how these findings compare to easement negotiations for pipelines that have eminent domain rights, given the differences in power dynamics that are likely present between operators and landowners, and how much power landowners feel they have to be able to set the terms of those agreements. So Okay, about 2/3 of these easement signers were represented by attorneys, but regardless, a portion of easement holders also experienced a range of issues related to the pipeline, including construction activities outside the designated right-of-way, property damage, and half of these landowners reported having experienced emotional stress or disagreements with Shale. So the final part of our survey asked respondents to reflect upon governance structures, public participation, and regulations of pipelines. Most all respondents reporting having either neutral or little trust in multiple levels of government, industry to make decisions about pipelines, with slightly more trust expressed amongst easement signers and surveyed landowners. And in a separate question, all respondents across the board expressed having little or no opportunity to actually participate in pipeline planning in their community. And we define participation as being able to shape the nature of the ways in which pipelines are built. And meanwhile, all respondents consistently also felt that public trust in regulators, industry, and community involvement in pipeline planning had become worse over the 2 years prior to our giving them the survey. And then the last set within this area of regulatory futures was asking respondents to reflect upon a set of proposed regulatory changes that might shape the ways in which pipelines are built and operated. And we found broad support for new rulemaking that would require operators to be held liable for damages to drinking water, requiring advance notice for construction activities, additional public hearings, and greater accountability for land agents. But we did not find similar support for more extreme suggested actions such as a pipeline moratoria or leveling tough penalties against pipeline protests that obstruct pipelines. And I have a whole separate study that's running that's actually assessing these anti-trespass bills, and they're quite significant in passing across a lot of states. And I thought it was interesting, at least in this case, people who were implicated in a pipeline did not feel as though that was a necessary step on the part of state legislatures. So just some concluding thoughts here. Taken as a whole, I think our findings start to represent some unique insights into the values of landowners as they trying to make sense of their entanglements with these pipeline projects. I think these findings begin to reveal why landowners assume risks to personal health, property, and environment, as well as how their perceptions to pipelines and relationships to their community do and do not change due to new experiences with these projects. And the decisions of individual landowners along pipeline right-of-ways are not trivial. They are essentially de facto decision makers in pipeline planning, and their risk-benefit balances can influence how these projects take shape, not just in their own community, but also in the many communities that exist between sites of production and consumption of petrochemical products. And while it may be tempting to infer from our findings that landowners who perceive greater benefits and fewer risks are the enablers of pipelines, this largely ignores the fact that requests for pipeline easements tend to come to landowners and not the other way around. And instead, that we offer that perhaps our findings show how landowners who sign easements or consider easements perhaps underrate their appraisals of future risk in order to rationalize the present decision making that they are undertaking. And alternatively, we also need to consider the possibility that landowners who sign easements may perceive risk differently precisely because of the additional knowledge that they gain while interacting with pipeline operators and in observing how pipelines are constructed and managed on their property. And I also just want to mention briefly this second survey that my research team just completed. And this is of 103 public interest and nonprofit advocacy organizations across the country who are working on pipeline-related public and environmental health issues. And findings from this recent study are providing some sense of alignment and disconnect between landowner concerns and how the nonprofit community approaches their work. So in that new study, and we're now just kind of analyzing this data, we asked, for instance, like what issues were especially important to these organizations, and higher level concerns such as climate change, public health, and environmental justice topics topped the list. Yet the majority of those organizations, as they mobilized their work through public education and outreach activities, organized around things like landowner needs, responses to accidents, and addressing regulatory gaps. And I think this points to how theories of change can also coexist within practical support for landowners. And also of note in this new study, we found that a lot of these organizations are really honing in on public participation in pipeline planning as their primary directive. But we found interesting trends where successful gains are largely happening at the local governance level, despite the fact that pipelines are regulated largely at the state and federal level. And we're going to be holding a webinar in the new year for participants who were part of that study and helped us with the data, many of which are represented by people here today. So stay tuned for that. And just a final word, I think that there's a lot more to discuss from the data that I'm presenting here, and we're presently pulling together a manuscript on the full findings. But I think that the study is actually a critical step in understanding how and why landowners assume these certain levels of risk, and we hope that the results can inform not just the practices of community interest groups that engage with landowners, but also policymakers and public health researchers that want to explore the nature of risk perception, exposure, and response related to this industry. Thank you.